Let's do this. Let's do this. Let's do this.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of TNT Live, where change gets human. I am here with Tanya, and we are going to be talking today about a creature from the sea. Every episode, we will dig into what it really takes to help people, teams, and organizations feel ready for change. And today, we're going to start in the sea, in the ocean. The most adaptable creature in the ocean is the octopus. It has no skeleton, nothing rigid to protect it, or so for it to protect, and it can move through openings you would swear are impossible given its size. It has 3 hearts, and it also has 9 brains, 1 central and 1 in each arm. And we're going to spend the next half hour talking about why that matters to how you lead through change. So, how did we land on this octopus in the first place? Honestly, we didn't go looking for this at all. I came across it while I was doing research for a land acknowledgement that I was writing. And the more that I read, the more that it started to resonate with me. And I really started to believe that it belonged in this work that Tanya and I do. So, Indigenous peoples in the Pacific Northwest coast have long regarded the octopus as a symbol of intelligence, of transformation, and adaptability. And once I saw it in that particular context, I really honestly couldn't unsee it as a leadership and change story too. So Tanya's going to kick us off today, and she's going to talk about why the lack of a skeleton within an octopus correlates and resonates within the change story.
Yeah, thank you. Good. Hello, everyone. So let's start with the fact that the octopus has no skeleton. That in itself is interesting. Like, have you ever thought about the way that they move? Have you, living in Alberta, we probably don't see octopuses out in the wild, but if you visited an aquarium recently, then you've likely seen an octopus, and they're very fascinating creatures when they move. They're very fluid and they're not rigid. And so when I think about companies, rigidity is what makes companies hard to move through change. It's not that lack of process. And so then it got me thinking about how rigidity can show up in many ways in the organization. And it's often a sign-off chain. It could be in job descriptions. It could be a hierarchy that won't flex, or process steps that don't account for agility or the way humans naturally work and change. And so that, although we have those pieces in place to help us, sometimes it can actually detract on what we're trying to do. And when we think about organizations today, every day they're operating in a space of change. And so it got me thinking about, like, how do those processes and systems show up, and how do they actually work against us in some ways? And so that rigidity piece, though, on the other side of it, when you think of it, can often feel like safety to people because it's what they're used to. And we know as humans that we don't like change. I know I don't like change. I'm sure if you thought about the last few things that have happened personally, like, change is hard, right? And it's ironic that I say that so openly, that I don't like change, because here I am working in this space of change, enablement and change management. But like, as a human, there's times in my life and in the workplace where I have not enjoyed the change that's been presented. And so that helped me, to think about, that safety piece that people feel. And so when I think of myself, I say I don't like change because sometimes I like things to stay the way they are. And then there's other times where I'm running 20 steps ahead and I'm like, follow me, this change is exciting. Tiff, you can probably associate with that as well, right? And so going back to that piece, rigidity can often feel like safety to people, right? So removing it can feel like removing the floor. There is known no known piece in a chaos of change, and that can feel comfortable. But the rigidity causes chaos, tension, and wasted effort in some cases, and it can even stall the change, right? So if I think of that from, the hierarchy of an organization, for instance, and so I came from an organization that had 6 stratums from the CEO down to the frontline folks. And so every time there was a change, there was a level of hierarchy that we needed to get pieces of the project approved, or, thinking about when a project went sideways, then all of a sudden we had team meetings put into our calendar because we had to share what went wrong and how we were going to fix it with all of the leaders across the organization. And that actually took away from the time and the space to give people and allow them to go out and search for that answer and innovate in those moments where they needed to, right? And so, I think the reframe around that rigidity is, how do we still use and leverage those processes when it makes sense, but also not keep them so much in place that it detracts from the change. And so, when we talk about the skeleton showing up in the organizations, those sign-off change, the job descriptions, how do they work for us and how do they work against us? Tiff, do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I really appreciated the fact that you brought up that sometimes rigidity feels like safety, because I think that really is one of the largest mechanisms to a stalled change, is that I'm staying in my comfort zone. And we're so used to processes that walk us through step 1, step 2, step 3, and whether that is the hierarchy within the organization, like my line level up manager, my next line level up manager, like we're so used to this, kind of very, very rigid step 1, step 2, step 3. And because that is our comfort zone in the way that we work, we forget that sometimes those steps are actually holding us back, or the energy to take those steps is wasted when we should be a little bit more agile. And the tie to the octopus about being able to get into spaces and move fluidly around obstacles and, kind of into and out of spaces, I think really, really ties to how companies are going to need to shift and adapt in this next level of business where change is going to be constant.
Absolutely. And I think too, when we think of like how we navigate change, and like even when I put my own self, back in some sort of personal change or professional change, it's that fluidity of moving through it and understanding how I'm showing up in that moment that helps to navigate what's working well and what isn't working well. And when you have those rigidity pieces, like a checklist almost and a ladder, it doesn't allow you to move fluidly, right? When you think of a ladder, you have to take one step, then you take the next step, and then you keep moving up that way. And being fluid is really about, like, I think of water flowing in a river, right? Like they might come up to a rock, the water, but it fluidly moves around it. And so like an octopus would be the same way. They would come up to a roadblock in the ocean, of another animal or some kind of coral, and they would have to navigate through that fluidly and move around it. And that's the same with change. So I think It's really interesting. A lot of metaphors there, hey?
Yeah, I know. We're starting with the octopus.
Absolutely. It's super interesting. Now I want to go to an aquarium and watch an octopus for hours. So the other piece about an octopus that I think is really interesting is that it doesn't have one engine running everything. It has 3 that come together to keep it alive. So at the beginning, we talked about it having 3 hearts. And so what are the hearts of an organization that is change ready? Is it the psychological safety? Could it be the leaders that work to role model that change? Or is it a team's understanding of their work within the change? And that could be, you know, going back to our change styles and how they show up and learning their superpowers. So, like, let's talk about what are the hearts of a change ready culture and organization. Tiff, why don't you jump into that?
Yeah, and I think this one's super interesting because I don't know that there's one answer with this specific piece, because I think like the heart of an organization itself is different depending on the organization, depending on its values, depending on, you know, kind of its mission and its vision, its strategy. So I think, you know, if I think about the heart of an organization, and I compare that to several different organizations, you know, like even my own clients, the answer to that is different. So if we think about the heart of a change ready organization, honestly, and you and I kind of went back and forth on this, like, I don't know that there's one answer. But I think what's super important for us to really focus on is that there's three. So when we talk about the heart of the organization, there's three engines that should be running a change ready organization. And I think that for companies to spend some time thinking and reflecting when they're doing their mission and their vision or their strategic work, asking themselves this very question: what are the three engines that drive our organization? And whether it's specifically due to one big change or just, you know, kind of managing through the new era of business, I think it's a really important question to bring to the table. I think for, if I take my own organization into it, I would say for us, the first heart would definitely be psychological safety. You know, making sure that we are building a space where all change styles can come to the table. And you and I talked about the challenger missing in our last episode, a super important piece to the puzzle, making sure we're creating space for all of the change styles to be represented and to be seen, valued, and heard. So I think psychological safety definitely is one of the hearts or engines in our business. I would say that leaders role modeling, whether that's role modeling the change, role modeling the mindsets and behaviors. If we say that we're going to do something, people will still not believe us or do it themselves unless we as leaders do it. They actually have to see us doing it. So we need to be very cognizant and intentional about what we're role modeling to our people. And then I would say in a change ready organization, so for us in, you know, kind of the growth stage that we're in right now in the scaling place, we're going through a lot of change. And that's kind of almost a constant, not quite, but fairly fluid. So for us, understanding those change styles definitely is would be our third engine or our third heart, because it allows us to have open, honest communications. We have a shared language with each other about, you know, what the challenge is, what the outcome should be, where we're moving to, and we also have an ability to talk to each other about where we show up and what that looks like in change. So I think, you know, like I can talk, you know, all day long about how I'm an accelerator and a challenger. And, you know, like my team can talk about, you know, the collaborators can talk about, you know, their role in it, as well as, you know, the challengers and whatnot. So I think that there's a lot of value in that as one of the engines or the hearts of the business. What about your company? Like as you're, you know, building and growing, what does it look like for you, the hearts?
It really lends back to like people, I think, and like using, you know, how we show up and how we feel like we belong and that alignment piece. I keep like, as you were talking about like psychological safety, leaders, the different change styles, collaboration, and like all of that came back to like, how do we align ourselves in the change and see ourselves in the change as we move forward? And like, you know, people have hearts at the end of the day. And so, you know, we have one heart as humans. And I think like it's multiplied in an octopus with three hearts. And so, how do we lean into how do we use our heart and our intuition to guide us through that piece and like our own knowledge and experience and even our own feelings of vulnerability, right? And we can leverage all of those pieces to show up and create the environment where people can feel successful, and like you talked about psychological safety, how can they feel safe sharing how they feel? And I think those pieces really showed up for me as we dug into this.
Yeah,
So now let's
absolutely.
move absolutely from the heart piece into the brain. So Tiff, why don't you lead us through this section?
So it was really fascinating. I think this was the one that really just, for me, just created a ton of curiosity. It was something I didn't know when I started doing research into this. And octopuses have 9 brains. So they do have one central brain, but it doesn't act as a central brain. They have 8 brains, one in each of their legs. And this was really interesting because they all act independently. So I'm like, their arms themselves have their own brain and they're sensing, they're deciding, like their arm will think for itself and decide whether or not it's going to move in a certain direction, whether it's going to wrap around something on its own. So each independent arm is thinking, deciding, and moving on its own. It's sending signals back to the central brain. So, everything can then move together because you wouldn't be able to have, one arm going over here and one over here. So that central brain keeps everything kind of coordinated in the same direction. But this is really interesting when we talk about how organizations move through change. If we've very much in change management, and you and I have created a little bit of a different model of change management, but in traditional change management styles, there is one central brain that is leading everything. And I think that, if we go to our model that we created, we definitely subscribe to that, kind of intelligence at the outer edges. So people are empowered, their capability is built to the point where they can actually think, move, and sense on their own. But then that collective, central brain then just makes sure that everyone's moving in the same direction. And I think that, given that this is not new knowledge, and as we discussed at the beginning, that Indigenous peoples have seen the octopus as a symbol of intelligence, transformation, and adaptability, it completely makes sense that it really aligns with how you and I approach change, and how many organizations will be moving through change in the future. So it's I think that when we think about what that means as far as, the smartest creature in the ocean not leading from its center, how do we build that in so that we can then trust the intelligence, the collective intelligence within our teams to be distributed to the edges of our organization? And I think that, if we think about where most organizations lead from, it is from a center. So can we actually move the needle on that? Can we devise systems, processes, hierarchies that allow us to go further than that? In your work with change, have you seen any organizations that have distributed intelligence out to the outer edges?
Not traditionally, right? I think that, in most of the organizations that I've worked with, they're still set up in a way that there's a general hierarchy that exists. And there are also pockets of the organizations that I work with who are set up in this way. And it starts with the leaders and how they show up to model that vulnerability. And even the word delegation comes to mind, right? Like to spark innovation. And so, when I think of those organizations, they almost followed the model that we're building and sharing and piloting, where it's about leveraging people's 9 brains, for lack of it. Like, it doesn't have to be 9 different people. It could be one person, and, digging into that person's capability, their passion, their innovation, and how they show up and support the rest of the team. And so while a lot of organizations aren't set up this way yet, I think we're starting to see pockets of organizations model this behavior, and then it percolates out almost like an arm in the organization, right? Because other areas see what's working well and they want to emulate that piece. And so with some of the organizations that I've seen, they've set up, quote unquote systems where folks are psychologically safe to share their ideas, and they know that there's not going to be any consequences with coming to the table with a wild idea. And they have a leader who says, yes, let's try that. Here, there might be some guardrails in place around trying it, and they're still given the opportunity to go out and test that in a systematic, safe way that wouldn't put the organization in too much risk. So I think over time, as this model percolates through the organization, I think we'll start seeing it more and more. And it really is a culture shift. And it's a way of thinking and a way of behaving. And so I'm excited to see, how that transformation happens in the real world. And I think in some cases, in my own experience, where it's been too rigid, I think people get nervous about putting their hand up almost and saying, like, I have an idea to.
Well, folks, it looks like we temporarily lost Tanya. What we can do is we can just come along, and Tanya was bringing up some really, really great points around, the psychological safety leading to a lack of agility within the organization or within the change itself. So I think that, as we continue to talk about this, and when you're working within your organization and really, kind of breaking it apart, the idea that there's no skeleton, the idea that there's 3 hearts and that there's 9 brains really starts to lend itself to building your own framework within the organization for how you're going to actually manage through change. So now what we also wanted to talk about, obviously, is what do you do with all of this on Monday morning? And as we wait for Tanya to come back and join us, one of the things that her and I had, really started to discuss, and I mean, I'm not going to have her versions here, but I can definitely start building into, and she's back. Perfect. Perfect timing. Welcome back. So I had just moved on to, I summarized a little bit about what we were talking about there with the 9 brains, and started to really throw to the audience some curiosity around how do they build their own frameworks around the lack of a skeleton, 3 hearts, and then the 9 brains. And now, kind of spending the last few minutes that we have digging into what do we do Monday morning? What does that look like on Monday morning? So you and I kind of talked about, giving the audience some ideas around what could you do if you wanted to stop doing work that added to a skeleton. Did you want to start just because you just joined us back?
Sorry about those technical difficulties. I have no idea what's going on with the internet today. So when I was thinking about a skeleton, the one piece that came to mind through the change work I've been involved in is that oftentimes questions start getting routed through one person, and they can become a bottleneck. No matter how smart or how much capacity they have, routing questions through one person doesn't always become the best strategy in the framework of change. And so, through my experience in the change pieces that I've worked in, we've started leveraging a network of change agents in the organization. And so if you think of a system change, for instance, it is finding those subject matter experts who are closest to the change itself and leveraging their perspective, their experience, their collective intelligence, and, bringing them together so that they can become that subject matter change network, and that a lot of the questions can start being routed through them instead of one person. And I think we traditionally see the change manager as like the go-to person in the organization for all things related to change. And in my experience, that's truly a bottleneck. Having sat on a number of change initiatives, including larger transformations, I'm not the person in the room that knows all the technical details about the change. I'm there as an enabler of change so that the leaders in the organization, the sponsors in the organization, the managers, and the folks closest to the change can come together in a network and support one another and get the answers that they need for the other people. And so I think that's one way that, you can stop leveraging that skeleton on Monday morning when you go back to your workplace. Start thinking about who are the people that are most affected by change and know the most about the change, and start, leveraging their experience to share that information with other people.
I love that you mentioned that you were an enabler. Like, I think that that's like, as the change manager, when we work with organizations, and you and I have talked about this a little bit, is that, like, what's our role when we work with companies? Like when we start to go into a client organization and start doing this work, we're labeled a change manager, which traditionally does put us into this, like hierarchical stance. And I think that, instead using that word enabler, I think is brilliant. And I think that that actually shifts even the mindset of those that are working with us in change. So thanks for adding that into the conversation.
Absolutely.
When we let's move into the heart. So, I mean, if we think about how do we start incorporating this idea of 3 hearts into an organization around change, what does that look like on Monday morning? And I think this one for me really resonates with our last conversation around the challenger, and that is giving people a very deliberate and intentional way to say, hey, like, this isn't working for me right now. It's not landing for me right now. I have a problem with this, or, can we just pause without it being labeled as resistance? I think that using those terms and that language around resistor, around opposer, those types of things really shuts down the conversation. And if I think about what it is, and I mean, we touched on this, like the psychological safety being one of the engines that drives, an organization through change, and that heart, I think it's very much making sure that people have a space, and it's all people, to be able to say what they need to say in order for them to naturally move through change. And if we think about the change styles themselves, that is going to present itself in a variety of different ways, depending on which change style that person predominantly is. But if we can create space for all of it intentionally, I think it just allows everyone to move together so much better.
And how frustrating is it to be labeled as something, right? And like, it goes away from what we're talking about with your heart when you get labeled with something, and it doesn't create that psychological safety, like you mentioned before, that is needed to really dive in and say, hey, this is a signal instead of some deterrent. So that's an awesome way to look at it. And I think the last piece to touch on is, how do we push a decision out to the edge? So when we think of those 9 arms, how do we push decisions out to the edge to those brains instead of pulling it to the center? And we talked about like the skeleton and the hierarchy. So it's really thinking about like, who are the people doing the work, and what would we need to go out and ask them first before we roll something out, right? And so,
Absolutely.
likely they know the answers, and they're waiting for that space to put their hand up to say, hey, pick me. I have a solution for you because I've lived this for many, many years and it's not working. And here's what my thoughts are around it. And so I think leaning into creating that space and that network that we talked about with those subject matter experts is really important to go out and, dive into where is the work being done. Get out from your office and go to the front line and see how things are working. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up a really good point there that I think it ties it all together really nicely. And that's, we still have to move through the change. So people can have a space to say the things that they need to say, They can be part of the expertise that drives and builds the change. And we can ensure that we aren't rolling all of the questions through one specific person, or even one, kind of chain. And in all of that, there can still be the accountability and the expectation that the change is still going to happen. So really, it's about, when we get together in the beginning and we're building the change itself, we set the expectation that this change is going to happen, regardless. But we're going to make sure that everyone has a say in how, when, why, and we move through that together. So it's not about allowing any of this to stall the change. It's not about saying like, hey, we've got 100 different opinions and how are we going to incorporate them all? Sometimes the answer is, thank you very much for sharing. We really appreciate your honesty and your transparency. And in this particular case, we're not going to be able to incorporate, your feedback because of XYZ. And just making sure that we also have an accountability back to the parties that, we're creating this space for everyone's voice. However, we're not going to be able to incorporate everything moving through a change, right? So organizations must change for certain reasons. And if it's, an ERP change, if it's a systems change, sometimes it's due to, a financial impact, sometimes it's due to a process impact, or even, an efficiency impact. And all of those things will, dictate that the change has to occur. And now it's about working together to get to the end. So less skeleton, more hearts than you think you need, intelligence that's pushed to the edges. I think it's a really good brief for leading through change. And I think organizations can use that to start building their own internal framework for, kind of managing through change, adding the change styles, and you start to build out a really good change plan. I thank you very much for everyone that came today. Tanya, do you have any closing remarks before we announce what our August 27th topic is?
I loved today's conversation because it was truly from the heart and human, which was all about the metaphor of the octopus itself. And I think, coming back to what I said earlier, we don't always like change. I'll admit that as well. And so when you think of the octopus, and like when I think of the octopus for myself, it really allows me to lead from my heart and from my head at the same time, and to navigate how I'm going to fluidly move through the change, which is what we were talking about to begin with. So yeah, I think it was an awesome conversation. And so as we wrap up, we are so excited to announce that our next live is on August 27th, where we will be talking about what is change management. We've heard this question come up many times, and so we're going to dive right in and talk about our journey through change, the methodology and why we've adopted it, and see what comes up through that conversation. And of course, we would love to hear from you for your thoughts. And we are so excited to dive into that conversation. So thank you again for joining us today on TNT Live, and we will catch you next time. Come back. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
See you.